Across the world, hundreds of millions of people have been rendered dependent on humanitarian aid following a natural disaster or slow onset crisis like drought or military conflict. This last is the case for millions in places like Gaza, Sudan, and Syria, where armed conflict has brought dire complications to the provision of much-needed food, water, health care, and other resource assistance. One recent example: on November 4, Israel informed the United Nations that it had withdrawn from its agreement recognizing UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. This followed Israel's recent vote to ban the agency from operating in the country and limit its ability to serve refugees in any of the territories it controls, including Gaza. The UN faces similar political challenges in Syria, where it cannot deliver aid to non-government-controlled parts of Syria without the consent of the Syrian government, and in Sudan, where authorities have denied aid convoys the travel permits needed to go to places not controlled by the Sudanese military. Each of these situations represents a unique challenge. Still, they collectively highlight a worrying trend in the delivery of humanitarian aid: the politicization of humanitarian assistance against some of the world's most vulnerable peoples. Here to discuss this trend are two experts from the Baker Institute Center for the Middle East: Kelsey Norman, director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees Program, and Salah Ben Hammou, a postdoctoral associate. Kelsey's work focuses on refugees and migration issues in the Middle East and globally. Salah's research examines the politics of military coups, authoritarian regimes, and democratization. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Kelsey, Salah, thank you for joining me. Let's start with recent developments in Israel. Kelsey, can you tell us exactly what the Israeli parliament voted upon and what it means in practice, or will mean in practice, for aid to Palestinians in Gaza?
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador. So the recent decision by the Israeli parliament to ban UNRWA, which is the main aid organization for Palestinians, not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in other neighboring host countries, will prevent UNRWA from operating and providing basic services to Palestinians in 90 days from when the decision was taken. Another aspect of the decision is that it will prevent communications between Israel and UNRWA, preventing it from coordinating, for example, in Gaza, on preventing civilians from being around military attacks, which unfortunately has led to more than 220 UNRWA workers being killed during Israeli bombardment over the last year.
You're speaking about deconfliction between the IDF and humanitarian assistance workers, particularly
Correct.
UNRWA. And is there a context for this decision?
Yes, an important context. So earlier this year, Israel notified UNRWA and accused UNRWA workers of having been party to and taken actions on October 7th of last year during the horrific Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians and military individuals. And it accused 14 UNRWA employees having participated in those attacks. The UN led investigations into UNRWA to discern the accuracy of these allegations and ultimately fired 9 UNRWA employees. It also led to a series of 50 recommendations taken by UNRWA to improve neutrality of the organization going forward. However, Israel has decided that this is not sufficient, that UNRWA, in its view, is not a neutral enough actor, and that it should no longer operate, both in Gaza and in the West Bank.
I would add to that an even broader historical context for this decision. While what you presented are the proximate reasons for this Knesset vote and the decision taken, Israel has long regarded UNRWA as essentially perpetuating the Palestinian refugee issue, to the point that while there are several tens of thousands of actual living refugees from the 48 and 67 conflict, there are millions of descendants of those refugees, all of whom UNRWA, under its General Assembly, not Security Council mandate, must recognize formally as refugees. Beyond that, Israel has, as you referred to, questions of neutrality of UNRWA education, UNRWA cultivation of national narratives, including that of victimization of Palestinians, the refugee issue in general, all of which have been longstanding Israeli concerns. And finally, UNRWA has been viewed by Israel, and I would note many in the international community, as essentially captive of those it serves. When UNRWA has attempted to reform, to take changes in the way it conducts business, particularly in Gaza, but not only in Gaza, its own workers, its own staff have been subject to threats, to intimidation by the very Palestinians whom it must employ and at whom it serves. It is a complex, long context to a very disturbing and very concerning set of decisions.
You're right. It is a long, complex history. I would add, too, that it's not only Israel that views UNRWA with suspicion and has viewed UNRWA with suspicion, but also Palestinians. So from its inception, the proponent behind its creation was the state of Israel, as well as the U.S., a top donor, to manage the Palestinian refugee situation, to ultimately integrate Palestinian refugees into host states. So Palestinians have long viewed it with suspicion as well as Israel. And UNRWA has always tried to sort of navigate this complex set of interests, as you said, in a complex situation. It is the primary entity providing these state-like services to Palestinians. At present, there isn't an alternative.
And now we turn to the immediate case. UNRWA right now, in one way or another, is critical to the delivery of about 80% of all assistance in Gaza, which is the key focal point right now. Are there other groups, World Food Program, other NGOs or members of the UN family that could take on the UNRWA burden if, in fact, it is compelled to discontinue its efforts in Gaza in particular?
That's a great question. So I've heard the top leaders of the World Food Program say that without UNRWA, it's basically impossible to carry out their missions because of the security risks to WFP employees in terms of actually operating on the ground in Gaza. And so without UNRWA, which has been the main entity, sort of the backbone of the aid response there, it's going to be very difficult for international organizations to operate safely for the safety of their workers and to ensure aid delivery to Palestinians in Gaza. There's been proposals also by the Israeli parliament that perhaps private military contractors could take the place of UNRWA, at least in northern Gaza. And the concern there is that those groups would not be part of the UN system. They wouldn't attempt neutrality in the same way that UN entities are supposed to by mandate. And if they were armed actors, that might increase the possibility for further violence in attempting to deliver aid.
All those issues are absolutely relevant to any non-UNRWA approach to this. But there's an additional issue. The UN has accepted, in extraordinary circumstances, armed escorts, armed security. But the UN, the NGO international community, insists that it or they be the ones to determine where they distribute assistance and to whom they distribute assistance. And any use of armed contractors or other elements in Gaza, for example, is one thing. The other issue is, would they be acting under an Israeli compelling mandate to only escort assistance to particular populations, to particular destinations? That would, I think, be a probably fatal condition for most NGOs and certainly any member of the UN family, WFP or other, participating.
Absolutely. So at the moment, during these 90 days until UNRWA has to cease operations, it's unclear what's going to replace the organization.
Salah, I'll turn now to Sudan, whose civil war is in its second year, and where roughly 25 million people are experiencing critical food shortages. What obstacles have humanitarian groups faced in delivering assistance there, and what are the key differences between the situation in Sudan and the quite unique situation in Gaza?
Thank you, Ambassador. So I'd like to start by mentioning that developments in Sudan allow us to kind of dispel a common misconception when it comes to humanitarian aid and issues with humanitarian aid. And generally speaking, there's often a tendency to assume that when aid workers aren't able to deliver aid to different communities, it's usually in the rural or in the peripheries, where these are hard to reach areas. But in this latest case in Sudan, folks in the set, or even in the capital of Khartoum, are unable to receive aid, which suggests that any obstacles that are present are political rather than practical. And this puts blame at the hands of the two warring parties in Sudan, namely the Sudanese Armed Forces, otherwise known as SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, otherwise known as the RSF. And there have been multiple reports of both sides engaging in different ways to divert aid from reaching their destinations. The case of SAF, for instance, there are indefinite delays to aid shipments into the country. Once aid shipments are able to move into the country, the RSF have attacked and looted these different deliveries. And this isn't unique to this current conflict in Sudan. If anything, there was precedent during 2006, during the Darfur genocide, in which the former president Omar al-Bashir himself had empowered the Humanitarian Aid Commission, otherwise known as HAC, to really crack down using quite draconian methods against humanitarian aid workers, which led to the suspension of many certain organizations from reaching any of the local communities there.
Now, diversion, weaponization of aid, is it a phenomenon on both sides? That is, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces?
It is, yes. So diversion and weaponization of aid are undertaken by both sets of actors. I would also mention another element to this is our affiliate groups that might not be directly associated with either the Sudanese armed forces or the RSF, but have emerged in the chaos that's ensued in the country and have started attacking groups on their own, with or without the approval of any of the warring factions. Another element that's important to mention is there are local efforts, such as what we've called like emergency response rooms and other mutual aid organizations, that have attempted to circumvent these issues of local aid, but even now they're being targeted by the warring factions. So there's plenty of blame to go around, but mostly it sits at the hands of the armed forces and the RSF.
And what relief, if any, can those most directly impacted by this violence, by the insufficiency of humanitarian support, to physically move out of areas of conflict, out of vulnerable areas, rural or urban, either within Sudan or outside Sudan?
So at this point, any type of relief that they can really hope for is going to be mostly locally based. And that's going to, again, bring up the issue of emergency response rooms and other mutual aid networks that are on the ground there. Those are individuals' best bet when it comes to trying to leave the country at this point, or even just like relocate within the country. The only issue is now the starvation and famine crisis has become so widespread that anywhere they would go into the country, they would be at continued risk of violence and starvation.
Does moving to Chad offer any greater access to humanitarian assistance?
It does not, especially with recent developments in Chad regarding the consolidation of power by the Deby regime. And the Deby regime has made it quite clear that it is not there to support the Sudanese refugees that are entering the country.
Kelsey, differences, similarities between the Palestinian situation, Gaza, West Bank, Sudanese situation, and Syria. While perhaps not the focus of international attention, as has been the case for Gaza, for Sudan has had its own vicious civil war, with deprivation, with a massive refugee, internal displacement, and external displacement, primarily to Lebanon, for over a decade. What's going on?
As you said, it's a very long-standing conflict now that's not entirely done, but is somewhat frozen. Protracted displacement, as you said, internally and externally. On the topic of aid, though, there is something unique, but also applicable to the other two conflicts in the context of Syria, and that was the cross-border aid mechanism that was established. So, as you said, Syria is no longer in the headlines. It's fallen out of international attention, but for a while it was. It was the world's primary conflict that it was focused on. And in 2014, the UN decided to establish a mechanism via the Security Council to bypass effectively the Salah government because of concerns that aid distributed to Assad-controlled areas of Syria wouldn't reach opposition-controlled areas. So for a period of 9 years, this aid mechanism allowed the UN, originally via 4 crossings and then ultimately via just 1 crossing from Turkey into Syria, Bab al-Hawa. So for every 6 months, this resolution had to be renewed, but it allowed the UN to directly get aid from Turkey into Syria without having to go through regime-controlled areas. In 2023, this was 2 additional points of access or entry were permitted after the terrible earthquake that devastated Turkey and also northern Syria. So for a while, the UN community was willing to bypass its normal rules around state sovereignty in order to ensure that the population of northwest Syria was able to receive aid. Ultimately, this no longer exists. Russia ultimately vetoed the cross-border mechanism. And so now the UN has to go back to ensuring that the Assad government allows the cross-border entry points to remain open. And so this mechanism was brought up in the context of Sudan earlier this year as a discussion of whether a similar mechanism could be used to cross into especially Darfur, which is a region that's been very, very hard hit during this current conflict. This would bypass the armed forces and allow entry of aid into an RSF-controlled territory without having to have the approval of the Sudanese government or the SAF. However, Sudan does not have the same kind of international attention paid to it as Syria did at that time of establishing the original mechanism, so there hasn't been follow-through on that proposal.
I would note there's another key difference. Turkey's role in both providing the access point, Bab al-Hawa, into Idlib, the northwest Syria area of a concentrated population of almost 3 million people, most of whom are displaced, has been vital. Turkey has basically been the critical mechanical element in making this unique preservation of that population's life because they are dependent 80% plus on external assistance possible. There is no such adjacent party, not Egypt, not Chad, not South Sudan, present in the Sudanese conflict, that is willing to advocate for, serve as the base for the provision of assistance into Sudan, nor does that external state effectively control the actual security environment on the ground through proxies or directly, as is the case with northwest Syria and Turkey. It's a very different situation, and I think because of those differences, ultimately has not been as successful, and the success in Syria is a minimal success, not a maximal success, in preserving this relationship.
That's a great point. And if nothing else, hopefully people can take from this conversation that politics always matter. Interests of various actors and states always matter.
Exactly. Now, diversion of aid. It's an issue. It's an issue in Gaza, in Syria, in Sudan. Is this an issue that can ever anywhere be fully controlled or fully managed? Kelsey, your thoughts first.
Great question. I don't know if it's possible to fully mitigate it, or at least I can't think of an example where it's necessarily fully mitigated. With the Syrian example, coming back to that, there were concerns and, many reports indicating that the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, was diverting aid for its own purposes, for patronage networks, and even humanitarian actors that are closely tied or effectively part of the Syrian government, including the Syrian Red Crescent, were party to those actions of diversion. So even when the UN was going through a humanitarian actor to deliver aid, it was still being effectively diverted by the government.
And I would note in Gaza, there was never a significant Hamas diversion of assistance. Direction, reputational enhancement of Hamas through being seen to be critical to aid reaching people, yes, absolutely. But the diversion problem began with the breakdown of security in Gaza, and it's the product of criminal looting, criminal access to what it can be now 50% or 50% plus of all aid deliveries are seized, not by Hamas, but by criminal groups, some of whom operate in an arrangement with Hamas. This is a complex situation, and it is more of a security challenge than it is a political matter, and even harder to address because of that. Sudan, diversion, any way to deal with it?
So I would say once aid enters a country, it's almost impossible to fully mitigate the issue of diversion because, and especially in a case like Sudan, where full state order has effectively broken down and so many different affiliated groups and groups that might not be affiliated with any of the warring factions have emerged, it's impossible to somehow keep full accountability against these types of actors. And as I mentioned, once aid reaches a country, it's up to effectively the political will of the different actors that are party to the conflict to ensure that the aid reaches individuals. So in some cases, there's incentives to actually allow aid diversion if it means bolstering patronage networks for certain areas, if it means cutting off supply chains to the opposition areas. These are all political considerations that actors that are party to any conflict would be making, and we see this incredibly in Sudan, in which, again, as we mentioned earlier, SAF is not allowing any aid to enter RSF-controlled areas, which means that there are alternative sources, and illicit networks also exist within these types of contexts as well. So there are folks, again, who are not affiliated with either the RSF or with SAF, who are effectively taking advantage of the situation. They're looting aid deliveries and then reselling them at exorbitant prices. I think the issue of mitigation, I think there's only so much that the international community can do. I think in many cases, and especially in a situation like Sudan, I think it's the nature of the beast in a sense.
Kelsey, international humanitarian law, often referred to. What does it require of governments on the basis of effective control of terrain? What is a government obliged to do with respect to entry and distribution of humanitarian assistance?
Well, international humanitarian law requires that even if a territory or a population is under siege or an occupation, that the inhabitants of that territory still need basic things: food, water, in some cases maybe more than that, services. And if we're going to come back to the issue of Gaza and Israel and the current conflict, Israel still needs to allow in these basic provisions for people to survive. UNRWA was one of the main distributors of those basic services and provisions. And in its absence, Israel, as the occupying power, will have to find some other way to ensure that the inhabitants of Gaza still have access to those basic things.
I would note that the U.S. government has told Israel it is not only responsible, and the U.S. government does not regard Israel as the occupying power, but as the effective authority in Gaza because of its military presence, that it's obliged not only to assure the entry of assistance, but the distribution of assistance as well, which is a much more complex issue. Israel accepts the first, its obligation to allow entry of aid. It has consistently rejected that it has a responsibility to assure that the aid can be distributed. This is a major challenge.
I can only imagine, and to the detriment, potentially, of people's livelihoods, of people's ability to survive and well-being.
So in the absence of adequate humanitarian assistance, how do populations affected cope?
Well, that's the most important question out there, and I think probably a misunderstood question in regards to international aid and the politics of international aid, and that most people, even in conflict settings or displaced populations, don't receive aid. So aid appeals from the UN, for example, are consistently underfunded. I mean, Sudan's a great example that Salah can talk more about, but it's funded at the minimal percent. Same with Syria. And as we know, there's issues of getting full required amount of aid into Gaza. So most people are not actually relying on aid as much as maybe they would like to. And so in the absence of that, it's up to much smaller on the ground organizations, if there are civil society organizations operating, or as Salah mentioned in the case of Sudan, mutual aid networks. Getting funding to these organizations, especially in conflict settings, is extremely complex, but there are ways. There are ways, even in, we can think of Syria, of the groups on the ground that were providing sort of life-saving services, getting people out of the rubble, basic food and water type of services. And so the reality is most people don't actually get aid. Getting aid into conflict settings is extremely difficult for all the political reasons we've been mentioning. And so there is a lot of self-survival strategies that people have to turn to.
Those strategies, though, limited as they may be in Sudan or Syria, are largely absent from the unique case of Gaza. Gaza is a closed, highly urbanized, heavily populated area where there are no places to go to. The extent of disruption is so comprehensive that without assistance distributed to specific populations, not just into but through Gaza, the severe risk of famine and starvation is very much with that 2.3 million population in a way that, even at the worst, the Sudanese conflict, Syria, don't present. Gaza, in many ways, is the ultimate extension of the problem of a humanitarian assistance-dependent population that cannot leave, cannot become less vulnerable while conflict continues.
Exactly. As you said, the internal displacement is just unprecedented in terms of the percentage of the population displaced, and they can't go anywhere. They're trapped.
Exactly. Thank you all for listening. To read more about Israel and UNRWA and the potential impact of the decisions taken with respect to humanitarian aid delivery, I encourage you to read Kelsey's recent article in The Conversation. A link is available in our show notes. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel and Gary Beaubien. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.